Is this the real life? Is this just fantasy? Caught in a landslide, no escape from reality. Open your eyes.
That's how one of the most renowned songs of all time, Bohemian Rhapsody, begins, with an inquiry into the line between two concepts we tend to take at face value, real life and fantasy, and the way in which they all too frequently blur. One of my personal favorite writers of all time, Oscar Wilde, once wrote that life imitates art far more than art imitates life. Real life reflects fantasy. In other words, fiction might be more real than you think. 10 years ago, I remember wondering what I would be like in the future, envisioning what I imagined would be my glamorous 16-year-old self, fashionable and fun, full of life. Obviously, I met that description perfectly. At that point in my life, my imagination was an invaluable tool that I used abundantly to explore my future. Of course, at 6 years old, I didn't have anything to worry about. Unbound by time, rationality, priorities, I wanted to flip through the book of my life without actually reading any of the chapters. I wanted to skim the present circumstances and get to a specific point in time that was far away from where I was then. But as would be expected, reality intervened. I couldn't foretell my own future. And even so, this couldn't dull the insatiability of my curiosity and the need that I had for certainty. And so from a very young age, my interest in the future was evident. Since then, I've explored the various different ways that I can use to try and predict my future. And though they haven't quite worked out the way I wanted them to, I found an answer, one that might just surprise you. To explore reality, use fiction. Being an avid reader, books have always consumed my life. To me, fiction, whether it's dystopia, romance, adventure, fantasy, whatever it may be, tells us truths about present circumstances that we often don't want to dwell upon. They tell us things about the current reality that we would often prefer to ignore. And when ideas are presented to us in printed form, in the form of a book, with an elaborate cover and a decorated title, it's all too easy for us to forget them, to dismiss them. We often read fiction, remember maybe the characters we relate to the most, remember the parts we liked the most and the parts we hated, and then we move on. And when we do so, we neglect what I feel to be the fundamental purpose of fiction, the fact that it is written by humans, for humans. And so in doing that, it may be, with the writer's intention, maybe an exploration of thought, it may be the elaboration of a dream or an idea, regardless of what it is, regardless of the original purpose that they have in mind. By dismissing and belittling fiction, we neglect the important role played by humans in the interpretation of fiction. In my eyes, fiction is more than something that should be viewed in isolation, as it reflects the reality of the present, the reality of the past, and perhaps, most importantly, the reality of the future. So, let's start our story in the 1940s, more specifically, 1948. The Second World War has just ended. Political and economic instability is rife. There is uncertainty, there is agony, there is frequent pain and trouble amidst various social groups. And it was in these conditions that the novelist George Orwell, whose real name was actually Eric Blair, wrote the book 1984, a book that he said provided a warning against totalitarianism. To gloss over the plot quickly, just for those of you who may be unfamiliar with it, 1984 is a story that tells the story of a society controlled by one omniscient figure known as Big Brother. He has eyes everywhere. And the main character, Winston Smith, struggles to rediscover himself as an individual in a society that has so long enforced the collective. In short, Winston's struggle comes about when he begins to defy the society that keeps him and those around him captive. The interesting thing about 1984 is the fact that it was written in a time where technology and TV screens specifically, as we know them today, didn't really exist. It was in a whole other age of technology where TV screens looked something like this. They were really fat. And why is that important, you might be wondering. We'll get onto that soon enough. In the novel 1984, certain citizens possess a TV screen, sort of, prototype, in their house or apartment, known as, in the novel, a telescreen. Remember that the novel was written in 1948. This was far before anything like the modern TV screen actually existed. So they possess this telescreen, which isn't actually used for entertainment and for leisure, but rather is used as an outlet through which they would receive recent announcements from the ruling totalitarian party, as well as be monitored by this party through it. In the same way that we are monitored by our devices, our phones, our laptops, our iPads. In that sense, they were also flat against the wall like modern TV screens. And it seems to me as if George Orwell almost predicted the rise of current technology, something that in 1948 nobody would have been able to envision. That demonstrates the necessity of imagination, an intrinsic human quality that we all possess, regardless of our vocation, regardless of our age, in shaping the reality of the present and the future. You're probably thinking, okay, cool, that's just one example from one book. How does that relate real life to fantasy? How does that relate to Bohemian Rhapsody? I'll get onto that in a bit. Last December, I really wanted to read the novel The Handmaid's Tale. And it was incredibly difficult for me to get my hands on this novel because for whatever reason, it just kept evading me. It wasn't available on my Kindle, I couldn't find it online, and I couldn't find it in any of the bookstores that I visited. Eventually, I did manage to grasp it. I read it in the space of 2 days, and it made me think, to say the least, a lot. Because as a 21st century reader and a woman, reading this novel, which was written not too long ago in 1985, about a dystopian society in which women were completely inferior to men, I think you can see where I'm going with this, in which women were completely inferior to men, all decisions placed in the hands of a small, elite, ruling patriarchal group. The ideas that the novel revealed to me regarding the authorities and their tendency to make ill-informed decisions that they then enforce upon the public was a bit too familiar. And it reminded me a bit, just a bit, of this, or this, or this, or this, or that, or this as well. Oh, sorry. So as you can see, the ideas revealed in the novel The Handmaid's Tale regarding the fallibility of those in power and their tendency to make incorrect decisions that they subject everyone underneath them to isn't really as fictional as it would at first appear. And obviously I'm not the only one who sees this comparison, as there are legions of women who protest in the clothing of the characters from The Handmaid's Tale, who obviously feel the same way. Margaret Atwood, the author of The Handmaid's Tale, imagined the worst possible future for women like herself, put it down on paper as fiction, sold it as a novel, and then watched it happen in real world. Her novel foretold the prevalence of hatred, of falsity, and the abuse of faith. It foretold the ugliness of society and the ostensible perpetuality of a group dominated by men who have no idea what they're doing. So far, we've looked at a book that predicted a past invention and one that foretold a present societal standing. And so you must be wondering, well, we've seen what imagination can do for us in the past, and we've seen what it can do for us in the present, and so you must be wondering, well, cool, what about the future? As a writer myself, I can tell you one thing about the future, and that is this, that the future is what you make of it. Imagination is crucial to the process of forging our futures in every aspect of our lives, be it technological, as we've seen in the case of George Orwell, political and social, or even economic. Every aspect of our lives is shaped in some way, in some form, by imagination. Of course, it doesn't and can't determine the future, that's up to us, but it can explore it, and it is really the exploration of imagination in fiction and the implementation of this that we then decide upon, that decides upon the extent to which fiction can become fact. That is how fiction becomes fact, and the implementation of this fact in real life, whether it's positive, as in the case of Orwell's telescreens, or negative, as in the case of The Handmaid's Tale, is entirely our own doing. As anyone in the audience today who comes into contact with children regularly will likely know, kids have an astounding ability to shape the future with just their thoughts. Their capacity for imagination and their freedom of thought is incredible. It's infinite. And just like playing the piano, learning a new language, or learning how to play a sport, imagination is a skill that we learn at a very young age. It's something that requires consistency and frequency through play, thought, and exploration, and one that, as we grow, is often neglected in favor of other, more practical skills, unduly. I know for a fact that when I was younger, in age, not in height, my capacity for imagination was enormous. The world stretched out before me, every idea was endless. To me, every idea was a good idea, and every thought was a potential story. every character, every figment of my imagination would in my young mind definitely become the next Harry Potter. When I wrote my first novel, I didn't really know where I was going to go with it. I was 10 years old when I started writing it, and I was 13 by the time it was finished and published. And all I had in my mind then was the desire to explore the depths of my imagination and just see where it would lead me. With that in mind, the book itself isn't really anything special. Titled The Land the World Forgot, it's a fantasy novel about a group of adolescents who discover they have otherworldly powers and then try and defeat an evil overlord. It's a cliche, a story we've all heard before. But that doesn't make its use as a symbol of my imagination, my easily excited, creative 10-year-old imagination, any less significant. The Land the World Forgot is a product of both my imaginative capabilities at the age of 10, as well as the confidence with which I communicated them. Confidence and faith that over time I began to lose, thinking that my ideas weren't important, that in the face of academia, grades, and numerical measures of my intelligence, my imagination stood no chance. As a result of that, my creative endeavors were sidelined, and I began to stop writing, stop thinking, stop listening to music. I began to stop caring. But I now have to forcefully remind myself that what I think and what I come up with does matter, that it can change the world if I act upon it and if I cultivate it, because effectively that's how the world works. Ideas, like seeds, to use a bad analogy, are planted, and they only grow if we nourish them, if we let them. So you see, imagination is much more than a way to escape reality. It's also a way to forge reality. And in my case, that's easy because I can just write and read. Those are things that I enjoy and things that I'm passionate about. And they're also things that closely correlate with imagination. But it's important to remember that imagination is omnipotent. It's an individual endeavor and a personal adventure. And so it's up to you today, as individuals who have different ideas, different habits, different hobbies, different thoughts, to do whatever you need to do to keep your imagination alive. Because effectively, yes, there is imagination in music. There is imagination in theater. There is imagination in literature, in art. There is imagination in fiction. But it's also important to recognize that there is imagination in science, in math, in business, in sports, in education. That there is imagination in reality. And most importantly, there is imagination in you. Thank you.